Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted. I should shake his hand. I haven't actually said hi yet, but David, welcome. Lovely to see you. Nice to see you again. David's a very decent man, and he was a great minister, Secretary of State for Wales, and a Brexit minister, as we know, and he's now with Reform, and obviously Wales Reform has done rather well in Wales, I read. So congratulations, David. But please tell us about Brexit.
Well, David, thank you for that kind introduction, and it is indeed very good to be here today with the Freedom Association, which has played an immensely important part over the years in defending free speech, unlike the musical gentleman outside, parliamentary democracy and national self-government, long before those arguments were politically fashionable. And I think it's fair to say that many of you I see in this room today understood the importance of the European question long before much of the British political establishment had the honesty to confront it. The association has invited me to speak today on the subject of Brexit has worked, but it needs to work much better still, and then the two killer words, here's how. And I have 25 minutes to tell you. But the proposition at the heart of that rubric is clearly exactly right. Because Brexit has self-evidently worked. We've left the European Union, which was the whole essence of the referendum. Parliamentary sovereignty has been returned to us in most of our country. We regained the ability to control our own laws, our own trade policy and our own borders, and we have escaped the legal supremacy of the European Union and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, those are not trivial achievements. They were constitutional achievements of historic importance. But equally, it is clear we must concede that many of our fellow citizens now feel a growing frustration. They look around almost 10 years after that referendum and they ask, why has Britain not achieved the full benefits of Brexit? Why do so many members of our governing class, not least our Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, still speak and behave as though democratic self-government were somehow an unfortunate interruption on the road to a greater European destiny? Well, I believe that the answer lies in a profound misunderstanding of what Brexit was actually about. And that misunderstanding was not on the part of the ordinary citizens of this country, but on the part of that same governing class, which, as we've heard, is currently straining every sinew to return to what they see as the safety and security of that European fold. Look, let's be clear. Britain is part of Europe. We can't deny that. Our history, our culture, our civilization are profoundly intertwined with those of our continental neighbors. We've traded with Europe. We fought in Europe. We helped shape Europe. But most of us never believed that we should be politically governed from Europe. And that instinct was not irrational. It wasn't inward-looking. It wasn't xenophobic. It reflected something deeply rooted in the British constitutional tradition, the belief that laws governing the British people should be made by institutions that are directly accountable to the British people. And that was the essential message of the 2016 referendum. Brexit was not a simple argument about tariffs or regulations. The Brexit vote was a democratic assertion of the British belief in self-government. And that is clearly still the belief of, to say the very least, a very sizable part of the British electorate. Indeed, you will have noticed that the areas that showed the strongest support for Reform UK in this month's elections were also the very places that voted most strongly for Brexit in the 2016 referendum, not least the northeast of England and my own beloved Wales. But Brexit wasn't the end of the argument about self-government. It was clearly simply the beginning of it. And if recent statements by candidates for the Labour leadership are anything to go by, it's an argument that's going to continue for some considerable time. But ladies and gentlemen, the desire of a free people to govern itself should never be dismissed as ignorance, ill education, or nostalgia. And yet, many voters now recognize that although the political class formally and ostensibly accepted Brexit, much of it was never truly reconciled to it. And that's why the years since 2016 have often felt hesitant, unfulfilling, and incomplete. The Conservative Party did deliver Brexit in law, but it never fully delivered it in government. Too many senior Conservatives were viscerally opposed to it, and I believe, frankly, many still are. Sovereignty was formally restored, but was exercised without confidence and without sufficient conviction. There certainly were successes. The vaccine rollout during COVID demonstrated the advantages of sovereign decision-making outside the cumbersome procurement procedures of the European Union. Our accession to the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as you mentioned, David, pointed towards a more globally oriented future. The AUKUS submarine project with Australia and the United States demonstrated the continuing importance of Britain's relationship with the wider Anglosphere and our closest democratic allies. But many of the wider opportunities of Brexit were only partially grasped. And now we have a Labour government, as we've heard, that is clearly and shamelessly determined not merely to dilute Brexit, but to undermine its democratic and constitutional foundations through so-called alignment with Brussels. We're told that Britain must once again place itself at the heart of Europe. Where have we heard that before? We hear constant references to partnership, dynamic convergence, and shared regulatory frameworks. And last week's King's Speech introduced plans for European legislation to be incorporated into British law through secondary legislation and Henry VIII ministerial powers with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. Now, all this matters extremely because the issue is not friendship with Europe. Britain should, of course, maintain close and constructive relations with our European neighbours. The issue is whether it's right that laws governing the British people should be made by institutions the British people cannot democratically remove, especially when the British people have already voted for those laws to be made within this square mile at Westminster. And that's the essential constitutional question. But I've put it off for long enough. Let's consider the trickier part of the association's question, how Brexit can be made to work better still. Well, I think that for a start, we must stop viewing sovereignty as an amorphous, insubstantial slogan and start treating it as an essential discipline of government. Every government department should ask itself a simple question, preferably on a daily basis. Are we using the freedoms delivered by Brexit, or are we merely preserving the habits of EU membership? Are we giving an illusion of government while continuing to follow the Brussels lead, or are we actually using our own powers to govern in the best interests of the British people? Every Secretary of State, I believe, should be ensuring that officials ask themselves that question every working day before they start work. Secondly, we must restore and maintain proper parliamentary control. There must be no automatic alignment, no regulatory rule-taking by stealth, no ministerial mechanism by which future EU law can be imported into British law without full democratic scrutiny. And we must, as we've already heard, confront the continuing constitutional difficulties created by the Windsor Framework, which Jim Allister has so eloquently just outlined, under which significant areas of law affecting an important part of our country remain subject to external legal authority and evolving European regulation. The framework, quite simply, was a fudge and can't represent a stable or enduring constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom. Thirdly, we must use our freedom to diverge intelligently, not divergence for its own sake, but where British interests demand it, we should be unafraid to act differently from the European Union. In artificial intelligence, gene editing, digital assets, financial services, clinical trials, energy, farming innovation and infrastructure, Britain should build its own regulatory environment shaped by our own common law traditions, clear, empirical, adaptive, and open to innovation. Fourth, we must control our borders with proper rigor. A country that cannot decide who may enter and remain within its territory has not fully recovered the practical meaning of sovereignty. That requires not only administrative competence, but also legal and political courage, including a willingness to confront the question of the European Convention on Human Rights and the domestic human rights framework, which frustrate democratic control. Fifth, we have to think globally. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was not just a trade agreement. It was a signpost to a new, expansive future. AUKUS was not simply a defense arrangement. It was a model to be built on. Because Britain's future prosperity lies in confident relationships with the United States, the Commonwealth, the Gulf, the Indo-Pacific, and the wider world, not in drifting back into the gravitational field of the European Union. And finally, we must recognize that Brexit will succeed only if it is enthusiastically pursued politically, as well as implemented institutionally. Brexit will not deliver its maximum benefits through people who regret it, apologize for it, or seek to dilute it. It requires a government that believes in it, and a government that understands the essential strengths of our British Constitution. And that brings me to one of Britain's greatest and too often undervalued national assets, the common law. The common law is, in essence, a uniquely elegant and efficient problem-solving method. Its genius lies in its empirical nature. It doesn't assume that officials or experts can foresee every future difficulty and prescribe solutions in advance. Instead, it proceeds from experience. It examines real disputes, real facts, and real consequences. Through precedent, reasoned judgment, and incremental correction, it finds answers as human activity proceeds. And that is why the common law has proved so remarkably effective across centuries of commercial, scientific, and technological change. It stands in contrast to the European tradition of civil law, which tends more towards comprehensive codes and prescriptive regulation, attempting to anticipate problems in advance and govern through increasingly elaborate frameworks of rules and obligations. And that difference matters enormously in the modern world, because at extraordinary speed, we're entering an age of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, autonomous systems, and scientific transformation. No central authority, however far-seeing, can anticipate every future development. In an age of such astonishingly rapid change, it's completely illusory to expect governments to devise in advance comprehensive rules for every unknowable future problem before innovation is permitted to proceed. The common law's strengths lies in practical reasoning, real-world experimentation, precedent, adaptation, and the ability to correct errors intelligently and swiftly as new realities emerge. The common law facilitates learning, adaptation, and growth, And that tradition is not only a British inheritance, it's shared by the United States and much of the Commonwealth. London and New York became the world's leading commercial court centers not by accident, but because businesses value predictability, precedent, and the disciplined practical reasoning of the common law. And the same principles underpin important legal centers such as Singapore, and perhaps most strikingly of all, jurisdictions with no historical common law tradition of their own. The Abu Dhabi global market, one of the world's leading financial centers, applies English common law directly because its founders understood the importance of legal certainty, adaptability, and commercial confidence in a rapidly changing world. That tells us something important. Brexit should not simply mean divergence for the sake of divergence. It should mean governing in a way that reflects Britain's own constitutional strengths: clear laws, accountable institutions, proportionate regulation, parliamentary sovereignty, and the full freedom to innovate unless Parliament has decided otherwise. If we are to reap the full benefits of Brexit, we must reflect upon that tradition and decide whether we are prepared to trust ourselves once again as a self-governing nation. That is the crucial political question. I'm convinced, one way or another, our political system will ultimately restore that confidence in national self-government, because our British political system is remarkably flexible. The Labour Party rose in the early 20th century because the Liberals could no longer reconcile the growing political demands of organized labor, industry, and mass democratic politics. The Conservative and Unionist Party was formed in 1912 through a merger driven by the constitutional question of the Union and Irish Home Rule. And the Social Democratic Party, though it didn't achieve office, altered the direction of British politics in the 1980s and helped force a realignment on the centre-left. History's lesson is that when an old order no longer reflects the principal political concerns within the country, a new one eventually forms. Our system ultimately tends towards equilibrium. When the electorate is sufficiently determined, politics reorganizes itself around the national question that matters most. And the Westminster system can appear turbulent, and it often is. Governments rise and fall, parties fracture and fragment. Political movements emerge, grow, flourish, and decline. That is democracy working through evolution and correction. And the British electorate has always possessed a powerful instinct for correction. When parties cease to command confidence or retain relevance, support moves elsewhere. Political energy reorganizes itself. New accommodations emerge. Old assumptions are tested and sometimes discarded. Now, that process can appear messy, but it's also peaceful, democratic, and workable. Britain has historically avoided the violent revolutionary convulsions experienced elsewhere in Europe precisely because our constitutional culture is practical, evolutionary, and corrigible. And I have no doubt that if the old political order cannot or will not deliver the full benefits of Brexit, the electorate will find another vehicle that can. That's our tradition. We argue, we campaign, we vote governments out, we replace parties, we form new ones. And through that process, the system renews itself. And in that sense, Brexit itself was part of a profoundly British democratic revolution, constitutional rather than ideological, evolutionary rather than violent. And I suspect that what we are witnessing now in our politics is not the end of that process, but simply its continuation. The outcome of that process will be a better working Brexit. And what will that look like in practice? Well, it will mean a Britain that builds again, that builds nuclear power stations, laboratories, data centers, ports, homes and modern infrastructure, and yes, indeed, more submarines with our American and Australian friends. It will mean a Britain prepared to be a global leader in artificial intelligence, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, and financial services, governed by clear and proportionate British-made regulation rather than by precautionary paralysis. It will mean strong defenses, secure borders, reliable energy, competitive taxation, and democratic accountability. And above all, it will mean a political culture prepared once again to trust free citizens, free institutions, and the accumulated practical wisdom of our own constitutional traditions. Brexit was never an end in itself. It was an aspiration, it was an inspiration, and it was an opportunity. An opportunity to restore democratic accountability, to recover confidence in parliamentary government, and to build a more agile, self-confident, and globally engaged Britain. And that opportunity still exists. But it will only be realized if we are prepared to trust our own institutions, traditions, and ultimately our own people. Because the desire for self-government is not an aberration. It is one of the most natural instincts of a free people. And the answer to democratic frustration cannot be to push more and more decisions further and further away from the electorate. The answer is democratic confidence, parliamentary accountability, national self-government, and a political leadership with a firm understanding of Britain's unique strengths and traditions and a determination to ensure that they are carried through. That, I believe, in my 25 minutes, is how Britain will finally realize the promise and the opportunity of Brexit. Thank you very much.
5 minutes for questions. We've only got 5 minutes for questions. Claire Fox has joined us. Nice to see you, Claire. And thank you for bringing the Battle of Ideas stand at the back. Claire Fox. And the lady here. And then, sorry, that's all we can do. If you take them together. Take them together.
What's that? Right, okay. I've heard a lot of Brexit speeches over the years, and I have to say that was one of the finest. It was really excellent. Anyway, the question is that I think possibly Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting have done us a favour, because in some ways they've given us an opportunity to rekindle that enthusiasm. Because I have to say that Brexiteers I know, and I'm one of them, actually it's a bit like having an embarrassing aunt or something. You kind of, yes, we're proud of it, but we don't talk about it very much. And I think that's true across the political spectrum. We've done our best at the Academy of Ideas to do something about it, but there's a little bit like, yes, we did it. We've allowed it to happen. So one of our problems is, this is the question, one of the problems is a lot of the attacks on self-governance are now homegrown. You know, the way that statutory instruments are used. I mean, I'm from the House of Lords. I mean, it's undemocratic. There's a lot of things that happen behind the backs of the electorate, even though we've returned power to home. So we have to take on our own democratic revolution domestically. I think that's one reason why people are disillusioned. And that's what happened exactly with immigration, isn't it? Boris wave, post-Brexit, British public didn't know about it, but nonetheless, we had open borders, we just didn't know, we had to blame our own politicians. Just how can we do more to expose our democratic deficit closer to home and not just keep blaming Brussels all the time?
Thank you, Baroness Claire. Just the lady there, have you asked your question, then we'll take them together. We've only got 5 minutes, so thank you.
Hello, Judy Moore, Independent. We've just heard of all the wonderful work you're doing and your position, which is the same as ours. What I'm interested to know is how is Nigel responding to this? Because I know many reformers that will, of course, support Brexit, and Nigel did before. Is he on board this time? Thank you.
Thank you. That's all right.
Well, two very important questions. I think that Claire is right. The Brexit narrative does appear to have disappeared, or at least taken a back seat in national discourse. And I think it does need to be restored. I mentioned briefly in the speech the outcome of the election earlier this month. And you actually saw the most enthusiastically voting Brexit areas of the country. And I remind you that Wales was the most enthusiastic area of the country, voting very strongly for Reform UK. So quite clearly, Brexit has not gone away as an issue. And what I'm looking forward to very much is seeing what sort of gyrations Andy Burnham executes in trying to persuade the good people of Makerfield that it's a great idea for them to return to the European Union, because that was an area where over 60% of the electorate voted to leave. I do think that we need to keep mentioning it. You'll recall that shortly after the referendum, various organizations were formed. One of the most prominent was Leave Means Leave. And I do think that there is scope now for that sort of organization. And I'm not talking about a particularly intellectual organization. I'm talking about people who will go out on the streets and knock on doors and tell people what the government is about and what they're trying to do. And keep the process going. The Norwegians have done this. And I think that we should do that. You're right, of course, about secondary legislation. And that's at the heart of this new bill that Starmer wants to introduce. Henry VIII powers. Don't worry the electorate too much by letting them see what we're doing. Just get some Whitehall minister to sign a statutory instrument and push it through. That is quite wrong. It's constitutionally wrong. Clearly it is. And we've got to do everything we can to oppose it. As for Nigel, well, I would suggest that Nigel's very raison d'etre is to ensure that Britain remains out of the European Union. He hasn't talked about it much recently, but a lot of the stuff he does talk about is associated with it. For example, the issue of the European Convention on Human Rights, which of course is something that he regularly discusses. That's an issue that, again, we have all got to get to grips with, and we've got to campaign on. And, you know, frankly, the other issue too, which I mentioned in the speech, and so did David and Jim mentioned as well, the issue of Northern Ireland. It's absolutely wrong that an integral part of the United Kingdom should be governed by foreign laws and subject to the jurisdiction of a foreign court. We should be outraged. Well, I am outraged, but I'm sure you're outraged. But everybody should be outraged about it. And that's part of the campaign that I suggest that we should be pursuing. Make sure people understand what an atrocity the Windsor Framework is.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much.